Welcome to Touched and Empowered, a show created to empower individuals to value their lives by hosting think tank discussions that will inspire positive action. Touched and Empowered with Katie and Ace starts now.
Hello, everyone, and we're back with Touched and Empowered. This time we have Michael Ashford with us. Michael is the host of the Rethinking Communication podcast and author of the book Can I Ask a Question? He is a two-time TEDx speaker, a speaking and leadership communications coach, and has been featured in Men's Health and Podcast Movement. Prior to his career in marketing, Michael was an award-winning journalist after graduating from Kansas State University. Ooh. You're right, Katie. That is very impressive.
I know that's a lot in a short period of time. And I'm just impressed with the fact that, you've been TEDx 2 times, that you're an accomplished author. I saw several books available. But what I was most impressed with was an article that you wrote. Are you trauma dumping on others?
Oh,
And
yes.
I want to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I was very interested in that as well.
That article came from a conference I attended earlier this year. I was out in San Diego, and as a speaking coach, I naturally just take in speaking and keynote speakers a little bit differently than your average audience member might. But keynote after keynote after keynote at this conference was it was these really intense stories of people's trauma, difficulties that they had overcome in their lives, really difficult periods in their lives, and how they moved through it to now find themselves on a stage, right? But I found myself at the end of those exhausted. Some of them got standing ovations. Some of them, other people were in the audience crying. But I was left with this question in my mind: what am I supposed to do with this information? Because what was happening is all of this trauma was being dumped out on the audience. These people were using the stage as if it were their personal therapy session. And I, as the audience member, had no idea what to do with it other than in that moment be inspired by their story. There was no what's beyond this. How do I take this information and do something with it that can be positive and productive in my own life? I just got a therapy session from you for an hour, and that's unhelpful, especially when it is time after time after time. So when we talk about trauma dumping, I talk about that from the stage, but we also do that in how we communicate, perhaps at work, how we communicate in our relationships with our friends. Sometimes that article has resonated with people because I think how a lot of people feel these days, especially with all that we have been through and experienced over the last, I'll say, 5 years.
I would agree. Actually, funny enough, I had a friend that would just trauma dump on me all the time. All the time. And at one point, I was just tired of just picking up the phone. And even then, it was like so grappling because I felt like the person really needed some other type of support, professional support. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, they thought me holding space for them would do that. And instead, it actually just like kept me sunken in an energy where I didn't want to do anything else. So it's very fascinating to kind of hear your perspective and know that it actually came from keynote speeches that were professionally put together and put on a stage.
It feels cathartic to the person doing it. And
Right.
so there is almost a want and a desire to seek that out. And the experience of being on a stage can certainly be ego uplifting as well. And so we seek that out. But you're right, Ace, in those moments where our friends do that to us and use us as that sounding board. That's okay to a point, I would say, but in how we communicate our own emotions back to them and set boundaries is really important, and not something that I'm sure many of us feel comfortable doing, especially around family, especially around long-term friends. There's an expectation that the boundaries wither away the longer you know someone or the deeper the relationship, and that's not always a healthy way to communicate.
That is true. And one of the things that I have learned, and I actually share with people, especially when you're in one of these, I need to unload something off of my chest, check in with the other person first. I need to vent. Do you have 5 minutes? Do you have 10 minutes? And if the answer is no, then I acknowledge that and we'll call one of my other sisters, or we'll call Ace, or we'll call one of my other friends, because you don't always know where someone else's headspace is when you all of a sudden unload.
It's very true. And it's a service, a kindness to the other person to just check in with them, and even check in with yourself and say, is this the person to hear this, to receive this? In some instances, yes. Sometimes it is good to be the friend there who can take that pressure, that release valve off of someone. But when it happens consistently, and when the other person never expresses what they need from you, do they just need a listening ear? Do they just need a shoulder to cry on? Perhaps do they need a solution or an answer to a problem? When they never communicate that back to the person who's receiving that trauma dump, that can strain and create tension within relationships that are ultimately, it can lead to what you did, Ace. I don't want to answer the phone with this person anymore. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
So, what do you recommend to improve that communication? Because from my standpoint, there have been times where I have had trauma in my life, and people asked, how can I help you? And my response is, I have no clue, because I don't know what I need. So, how do you recommend people finding how to reach that balance between sharing authentically and trauma dumping?
What you just said there, Katie, is really important. When you don't know what you need, that's always a good thing to admit. Just say out loud the things that you're feeling, the authentic uh, uh, voice that's within inside you of, I don't have a clue. I need to get this out of me so I can begin to process. Can you just listen for a moment and then help me process? Tell me what you hear. One of the most impactful sayings or phrases that we can repeat to ourselves is, the story that I'm telling myself is. And that can be when we're receiving information from someone, but that can also be a phrase that's helpful when we're sharing information with someone. When we're trying to process our own feelings and emotions towards someone, we can phrase it in that, or we can couch it within that phrase. Listen, the story that I'm telling myself about this situation is that I am a failure, a fraud, that I'm XYZ, like name whatever you have in there. How do you see it? Turn it back around and ask the question if that's what you want. Do you want that validation, or do you want some rebuttal of how you're seeing the situation? The other person too can say, listen, whatever, everything that I've just heard from you, the story that I'm telling myself is, you're not being kind to yourself right now. Give yourself some grace. Like, that phrase can be so helpful in how we begin the conversation when we share our perspectives of, we can be hearing the same words or saying the same things and have a very different perspective of what's happening in that conversation. When we can take a moment to align on what this conversation is actually about and how we're experiencing it in that moment, that can be a helpful way to ease the trauma dumping backlash that we've been talking about so far. I think it comes back to answering or asking questions of ourselves, asking questions about others, and then going and asking questions of others. That series or that sequence, that's what I write about in my book. That's what I talk a lot about on my podcast. As a trained journalist, I'm trained to ask questions, but I think if we followed our curiosity more than our certainty and our need to be right in conversation, a lot of these issues that we've been talking about so far would be not, maybe not cleared up, but made easier to work through and less uncomfortable.
Taking a minute to process that.
But
That's beautiful.
it makes sense, because there, at least for most people I know, growing up, it was always, the conversation was always who was right, instead of being curious as to getting more details or asking more questions or even just clarifying what I heard.
Mm.
So I do agree that that is a very important piece of communication that I think has gotten lost in translation.
I'm not sure it was lost so much. It was just never taught. I mean, I rag on our traditional education quite a bit on my podcast because the ways that we were taught about what effective communication looks like, I always sum it up as we were taught how to exert our views and opinions and beliefs and thoughts out to the world. What we were never taught to do is the extraction. How do I pull information out of someone? How do I bring information back into me that can inform my perspective or change my opinion? How can I hold loosely to opinions yet firmly to values? It's really hard to test against those things. That's why it's not taught. It can be taught, but it's much more ethereal. It's much more, you got to just practice it and experience it to know what it means to ask a truly curious question rather than one that is couched as a weapon to simply get your voice or your opinion out there to win the argument. Listen, in our K through 12 education, at least here in the United States, there's debate classes, there's public speaking classes. You have to write persuasive essays in English class. I was on the mock trial team where we played fake lawyers to win fake cases. All of it is, how do I get my certainty out? How do I confirm what I already know? Or how do I find the right answer? But how can there be a right answer when we're talking about morals, values, emotions, feelings? How can there be conflict? How can there be a right answer in so many of these nuanced and complex issues that we deal with on a day in and day out basis? Our traditional education failed us. Flat out, it failed us.
One of the
Wow.
things that I struggled with was I remember sitting at the dining room table growing up, having conversation with my parents, my sisters, and then looking when my son was in elementary school, we were eating dinner on TV trays in front of the TV.
Yeah.
We were not having those family conversations. So yes, I agree that the school systems might not have taught us the proper way to engage in the two-way conversation, but we lost that connection at home as well because we all found the TV to be more distracting or other now personal devices
Social media.
at the dining room table, social media. It's so I think for me, learning to ask just more engaging questions instead of how was your day?
Yeah.
My question to my son is, what's something interesting you learned today?
I love it.
And he's in college now, so I'm going to be getting some crazy answers with that. But what other questions do you recommend that we start practicing in our everyday lives so then that way we can have these more in-depth conversations with everyone in our world?
For one, Katie, I love that because my family, we have a rule: no TV, no phones at the dinner table. I grew up that way, and that is something that my wife and I have carried through we have dinner together every night. I'm the cook of the family. We sit down and have a meal with each other. And those dining room table conversations are, I agree,
Important.
part of all of this that we've talked about so far. So in those instances, I love that question. What's the best thing that you experienced, or what was your favorite part of the day? What's the most interesting thing that you learned today? Did anything funny happen? You can also ask, hey, what did you struggle with today? Those things that you go a little bit deeper past the one word answers.
Right.
I'll give you this as kind of a guideline. Do you know Simon Sinek?
Yes.
Okay.
I've seen enough of him online to know of him.
Yeah, Simon Sinek, Start With Why. That's his book. That's his famous TEDx talk is all about how finding your why and starting with why is the answer to a lot of things. When it comes to a lot of these questions that I would say are good for us to practice, I think why, I don't think you should start with why. And here's why. Why, when somebody asks you why, that's a deeply philosophical question. Why you love someone, why you acted the way that you acted, why you said the thing that you said. that takes some time to process a why question, because it goes beyond just what you were feeling in that moment or a split decision that you made. Why goes to the core of who you are as a person. And that's good to explore if you're like trying to come up with your company ethos or your company core values. But when you're trying to explain human behavior, asking why questions gets us into really uncomfortable space really quickly. So instead, I submit that you should start with how questions. Well, how did that make you feel? How did you come to that decision? How did you make that choice? We can dive into what questions as well. Like we talked about earlier, what was the best part of your day? When we talk about conflict, one of the questions I like to ask is, you and I come at this differently. What's been true in your life that you believe the way that you believe? Or how did you come to that conclusion about this issue? We so often will jump with, especially, we can talk about politics, we can talk about societal issues these days. We so often hit people with the weaponized questions of, well, you just believe this, so you think this, don't you? Well, that's a question, yes, but it's not a curious one. We ask why questions. Why did you do that? And you can hear it in the tone of my voice too. It's accusatory. The question is not curious. It's pointing the finger at somebody. When we can ask a how question, it takes some of the steam off of it. And now we start to understand the human experience, the nuance, the complexity a little bit more, that could lead us to a why question, that could lead us down that path. But we first have to understand how gets me in the mindset of, walk me through the steps, just the basic facts. I don't need to get into the philosophy or psychology of what you did or why you said it or how you acted. Just walk me through the basic steps. Let me understand that first. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How you got to that conclusion.
Yeah.
Kind of like, which to me makes sense because of the work that I do with the Teen Suicide Prevention Society. We know that whenever you ask someone who attempts why, most of the time the answer is, I don't know.
Exactly.
It seemed like a good idea at the time. And it's just because they hadn't thought through whatever process they need to think through. And I think that's an answer, I don't know, is a common answer to why someone does anything, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent. Not that anything's good, bad, or indifferent, but any action that someone takes, we are creatures of emotions. So we make decisions based on those emotions, and why doesn't really correspond with emotions. Versus, I like the idea of the hows and the whats, because it does connect with, well, this emotion led me to this action, or this action led to this emotion.
Yeah. You could eventually explore it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. A why question. Oh, we need some time to sit with that, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you were to ask me, why do I care so much about this? Be ready to talk for the next 2 hours, because I got a lot to say, but how? I could tell you that in 15 minutes, how I got to where I'm at now.
And it's a lot easier to ask somebody how they got involved in whatever work they're doing, because we do that with Touched and Empowered all the time, because we like to talk to people who've been touched by something and chose to be empowered by it instead of victimized by it. Right. So how did you make this choice? It's a lot easier for them to explain than the why did you decide to get involved, because that can come to trauma dumping if they're not prepared to have that kind of conversation. So I don't know if you can see it, but I'm connecting the dots in this conversation as I'm talking here. So it's making a lot of sense to me right now, which I appreciate.
Love that connection you just made there. That is fabulous.
Feel free to borrow that in your next book.
I just well might.
One of the other things that I wanted to ask about is that you had mentioned something in, I think it was in the form that you filled out for us, about ask and see. And I'm pretty sure because ask, ASK was in all caps, and see, SEE was in all caps, that they're abbreviations for stuff.
They are.
So can you unpack that for us?
Right. So over the years that I've been doing my podcast, I started it in 2020 and it was called the follow-up question at the time. I've only recently rebranded it to Rethinking Communication, but over the years that I did that in a search for common ground, how do we find common ground when we seem so deeply divided, polarized on so many issues these days? What I stumbled upon, or what I came to understand through the many conversations that I was having with people much, much smarter than me, is that there seems to be a mindset and a way of following your curiosity to overcome conflict, to communicate conflict, to eventually bring about some sort of positive change in the world or with a person, somebody you might disagree with, or somebody who you want to inspire to see it your way, perhaps on an issue or a topic. And so as I was writing my book and I started to package these thoughts together, it came to this. It's the ask, then see approach to conflict communication. Ask stands for assume positive intent. The S is set aside your ego. And the K is know that you can't know everything. And those are all mindset requirements or asks of us to really get into a place where you can communicate well through conflict. You've got to be in the right mindset. You can't be in this warlike stance where I'm going to win, I'm going to beat you, because what is winning anyway, right?
Right.
So if you can assume positive intent of the other person, even if you disagree with them, and that's really hard, but if you can assume that they have a positive intent, set aside your own ego and your need to be right, and know that you don't know everything and you couldn't possibly, then you can see. You can follow that mindset into the C, which is SEE. S stands for search yourself, ask questions of yourself. How did you come to your beliefs? Why do you believe that way? Do some deep introspective with a why question there. Why do you believe the way that you believe? Ask questions of yourself to get a fuller understanding of how you came to your own conclusions about this topic, about life, about this challenge that you're faced with. Then you go into examining other perspectives. You're still up in your head. You're still wondering about the world, but you're still in your safe place within your mind. Well, if I grew up as a white, Caucasian male in Midwest Kansas, outside of Kansas City, how did I experience the world? And how might somebody who grew up, let's say, in inner city Detroit as a Black woman experience the world? And how might they see this issue based on their experience a little bit differently? Just consider it. You don't have to agree with it. Just ask yourself the question, if my experience is so radically different from that person, where might the deviation points be? Where might we have experienced life that would lead to different experiences, different ideas of how the world works, how society is set up, all that good stuff? That's the first E, is examine other perspectives. The second E then asks you to go ask questions of others, and that is exchange your curiosity with others. Go ask questions of other people who disagree with you. Ask curious questions. If you don't have someone within your network who disagrees with you, your network is too small. You are in an echo chamber. You are in a box that your world is consumed by this one perspective. And if you can't go exchange your curiosity with someone who sees the world and has experienced the world differently than you, your borders are too small. That's the ask then see approach. And I guarantee you, if you follow that approach, because I have numerous examples of people who have overcome some incredibly difficult challenges and inspired some amazing change.
That, believe it or not, sounds pretty easy. And I know that it's not. I completely understand that it's not. But the steps, the way how you explain them sound very easy and very accomplished, easy to accomplish from someone who has been in a situation where everything was in my nice little box. And then all of a sudden my box exploded. And there are a lot of new opinions that my eyes are now open to, a lot of new facts that my eyes are open to. And the whole understanding as to my point of view, I don't know the other person's full story.
Right.
For me to understand where they're coming from, I need to ask the questions. What is it that you do? How did you get there? What do you want to accomplish? To have those more engaging questions and conversations instead of just asking, why do you think that?
Yeah.
Because of the whole why question, opening up a can of worms that not everyone has time to dive into. But I love the steps that you laid out because they sound like they're very easy to follow for somebody who is just now opening up their eyes to maybe I need to be more curious with the other people in my world.
I hope so. I really do. One of my favorite quotes is from a gentleman I interviewed. He's a futurist. His name is Brian David Johnson. And he said, the moment you assume or presume to know what someone will say, you've just limited that person. And I don't want to be somebody who limits another human being and the fullness of who they are. And so if you can follow those steps in that order, you have more fuller, richer conversations with other human beings because they're allowed in your presence to be the fuller version of themselves. I don't want to limit people.
I have an interesting question in response to limiting, I feel like a lot of people nowadays, like you said, if they're in that combative state, right, to be right, and then they're already creating this limiting belief of who you are in that very moment, right? How do you, I guess the word is, how do you take off that steam again, right? In that conversation and like readjust the conversation so that instead of being in that combative stance, how do you de-escalate the situation so that you can come to a better harmonious conversation, if that makes sense?
One thing that let me say this, and I want to see if this makes sense in the question that you just asked, Ace. Are you talking about the role of emotions?
I believe so. So let's say somebody is approaching, well, all right, let me play it by my own experience, right? So for instance, somebody tries to project a understanding of who I am and then limits me based off of that preconception, right? It is hard to, when acknowledging that approach, to change their mind as to who you are, and then the conversation becomes one-sided.
Gotcha. Okay.
So in that frame of reference.
Gotcha. Okay. So I want to preface what I'm about to say by saying it's okay to be emotional. Like things like that, feeling limited by someone else's assumptions or presumptions about you. Mm-hmm. Emotions will come out. Emotions are a natural part of communication. And to police our own and especially other people's emotions can get us into some dangerous conversations and waters where we're now arguing about you policing my emotions rather than the thing that we're talking about.
Okay.
But when you do feel that, when you do feel that urge to, or when you feel that you're making assumptions about who I am, you are creating this caricature, this stereotype of who I am, you can default back to questions. The story that I'm telling myself is that you believe this about me. Can you walk me through how you came to that belief? What's been true for you that you would think that me, an individual human, could be summarized by that label that you just gave me, or by that broad categorization that you just gave me? Because I'm feeling as if that's what's happening here. The story that I'm telling myself is you are placing me within a stereotype, and I would love to understand how you came to that belief. Now, tone matters here, because I could say that same thing in a harsh tone. You're trying to stereotype me, and I'm sick of it. How did you come to that? Like, how in the world do you think that that's okay? Do you hear the tone, the
Yeah,
shift in tone?
and you could have saved so many lives with that distinction right there.
Yeah,
So many people
definitely.
facing, yeah, there are so many people facing discrimination right now that I'm wondering how, from your expertise, you can continually de-escalate situations like this so that you don't come into those conflicts on the everyday street. And you just gave me an excellent answer to that.
I want to give you an example because it's great to talk in theory, but I want to give you an example from two gentlemen that I interviewed on my show and make a key point or a key figure in my book. Jeff Scoop was the former leader of the National Socialist Movement, the largest neo-Nazi organization in the United States. He served as its leader for 20 plus years, 22 years, I believe. He went years being literally punched in the face by people who are trying to get him to change. You're a Nazi and you're scum, and what you're doing is vile and hideous. I'm going to punch you in the face. Literally going to punch you in the face. I'm going to attack your children. I'm going to attack those you love. I'm going to sabotage your car to try and kill you if you don't change. Guess how well that worked? Jeff
Probably not at all.
Jeff dug in deeper. It dug his heels in deeper because he was protecting, again, if we assume positive intent of someone. Jeff told me he got in because he felt he was protecting his family, a way of life, his heritage. It was never about hate. Hate was fostered within the NSM, for sure. But he got in for a cause of protecting those he loves. And that is a value that we all hold. Now, the way that he went about it, sure, in hindsight, in our perfect 2020 vision, very skewed, based on hate, based on excluding, based on othering people, based on creating enemies of other people. Absolutely not excusing the behavior of what happened. But we can assume positive intent that he had a good reason that was good in his mind, at least initially. So a black man named Daryl Davis comes along. He's creating a movie about hate in America. Daryl has experienced plenty of it. Daryl has sat face to face across from Ku Klux Klan grand wizards as a black man. He's attended Klan rallies as a black man. He has marched in Klan marches next to these wizards and members of the Klan, not to agree with them, not to condone their behavior, but to understand them, to get behind the facade of what you see as the stereotype, right? Daryl has implemented exactly everything that I have talked about. Daryl has implemented everything that I've talked about. He approached Jeff not to judge him, not to point the finger in his face and say, why are you the way that you are? He just sat down with Jeff and said, help me understand. Help me understand what you believe. How did you come to those beliefs? What do you believe that you're fighting for? What are you what are you against? And why do you feel that that's a thing that needs to be fought for in this way? He just asked him curious questions. And over time, Jeff told me he realized he was less and less able to answer Daryl's questions about how he came to those beliefs and how he was acting them out. He was less able to answer those questions with a clean conscience. He started through just answering questions to understand the flaws in his argument of how he was living his life as a neo-Nazi, as the leader of the largest neo-Nazi organization in the United States. Just a few years after that, those initial conversations with Daryl, Jeff left. Jeff left the NSM. He stepped down from his position, and now he fights against radicalization. He has started an organization called Beyond Barriers, where he tries to get other people out of the movement, all because Daryl met him with curiosity and rather than certainty. That's how powerful this is. That's how powerful this can be, because Daryl's natural inclination, I'm sure, was to get angry. He and people like him were directly affected by the hate that Jeff's organization spread. But he didn't do the thing that all of us feel pulled to do, which is respond with hate, with fighting fire with fire, so to speak, with trying to bring the enemy to blows, to get them to submit so much that they can do nothing but acquiesce to our rightness. That's not what Daryl did. And when we go back to Ace's question of how do we approach when that feeling of overwhelm comes to us, it is over and over again. The answer is met with curiosity.
I love that your response is meet it with curiosity, because what I didn't realize was I had set in place 3 rules when I found out I was going to be a mom. And I told my husband, and he thought I was nuts. But my 3 rules were: speak your truth without fear, listen without judgment, and respond with love. Because that was the only way that we could express ourselves. And I wanted to hold those true for our son. Yeah, there were some very interesting conversations because of all of that, but it also gave reprieve, because my son knew that he had 24 hours consequence free from anything he told us. So there was no knee-jerk reaction to you're instantly grounded, you lose all privileges, what I didn't know is that 24 hours, he beat himself up enough that I didn't have to punish him. So it worked out great from my point of view. But in hindsight, it's along the same lines as to reaching it with curiosity. They are speaking their truth without fear, even if we don't understand it. And we can listen to people and respect their opinion without questioning it if we meet it with curiosity. And I think meeting it with
100%.
curiosity is just another way of responding with love.
I agree.
Because we want to know more.
That's how we show love to other people, right? You're so right. When we are genuinely in a state of love, we want to know more about that person. There's not enough information about that person in the world that could satisfy that desire for more information. So I agree. I love that framing in love. That's very good, Kate.
With all of the fantastic information that you have shared with us, what is one big takeaway that you would like to share with our audience?
It's actually something that we haven't discussed yet, but Katie, you bringing up love and approaching people through that lens and through that frame brings up something that I wrote about in a previous book. And it's called the 4 Ps, and it's how I live my life. I believe that we live our lives in balance when we live our lives prioritized in order of purpose, people, passions, and profession. And at any point in our life when those get out of that order, we feel unbalanced. When what we do as a profession jumps above our passions, or even in some instances, the people in our lives, the relationships that mean the most to us, we feel unbalanced. Things don't go right. We fail to respond from a place of love when that happens. When our passions take and supersede the people in our lives, the relationships that are most dear to us, that can cause issues too. When our passions come before our purpose, and ideally those things would be aligned anyway, but when people, for instance, come before our purpose in life, when relationships become toxic and don't align with what we believe we were put on this earth to carry out and fulfill, that can make us wildly misaligned, or feel wildly misaligned. And there are moments in life where we will be out of alignment for a bit. When we start a new job, for instance, it might come before our passions for a while. But if we consistently live out of order, out of purpose, people, passions, and profession, we lose sight of who we are. And one other thing that I'll say is my grandfather taught me, he was a gardener. And one time when I was very young, we were out in his garden and we were looking at the tomato plants. And he told me, Michael, a tomato given to you will never taste as good as one that you grow yourself. And I didn't know it at the time, but he was trying to teach me about the value of hard work, not about growing tomatoes, which are hard, by the way.
Yes.
So I also love the mantra, grow your own tomatoes. Do the hard work yourself. It'll always feel better than taking a shortcut. And that's what I'll leave you with here today.
Well, I appreciate that because we all know that growing is hard work.
Absolutely.
But putting in the work to growing, putting in that work for ourselves and then our relationships and then our passions and our purpose and everything else, it is very rewarding. So thank you very much for being a part of our show and for sharing your amazing insight and knowledge with us, especially when it comes to better understanding of the communication that we have with ourselves and with others. For myself, Katie, and with Ace, and again, thank you to our guest, Michael. We appreciate everyone listening to this episode of Touched and Empowered, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you for joining us. We hope that the discussion today will inspire you to take positive action in your life. Until next week, be empowered.